Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
My wife is transcribing some old family documents, and we came across an interesting first-person account of the Spanish-American War by one Joseph Goulet. Now we come to the time of the Spanish-American War. For a year or two, the Spanish General Weyler drove roughshod over Cuba. I suppose our gun runners furnished the guns the rebels used, but they held their own against the Spaniards. The slaughter was serious, and we were told included women and children. Certainly all they owned was put to the torch, and Cuba was in a bad way. So America called them down and said unless the situation would be corrected at once, the U.S. would feel it necessary to intervene. While negotiations were in progress, the battleship Maine was sent to Havana. One night after they got there, a powerful explosion from outside the ship destroyed the ship, and it sank with a big loss of life. Most of the young men hurried to join the infantry company of this city, company of the 5th Illinois, Troop D of the 1st Cavalry, and a section of the artillery company of Danville or Delaware, not certain. Everyone was now certain we would declare war, and I think April 22nd. And now a few more words about the mustering. We marched up to the State Armory, which was there at the northwest corner of 1898. We were mustered into service and marched out to the fairgrounds, where Company C was assigned to the horse barns, where there was a good quantity of straw. We were very busy drilling, marching, and getting our guns and equipment ready. Naturally, there was much picture-taking. The fellows all had a tendency to name their rifles after their girls. And now a few more words about the mustering. We marched up to the State Armory, which was there at the northwest corner of 4th and Adams, upstairs. As I said before, when the Maine was sunk, February 15th, 1898, everyone knew that war would result. No mealy-mouthed words or goofing around. It meant put up or shut up, and we had no intention to shut up. We who were in the National Guard, or about to do so, like Willie Merrick and I, joined in at once. Captain M.F. O'Brien was so certain there would be war. He began to recruit his company at once, and on April 22, 1898, received his orders to muster us in the U.S. service. First, we were examined. When my turn came, I was a little bit short. So Felix Streckman, whom we all knew at school, was the Army officer to muster us in, looked at me, and as he came to measure me, said, "Goulet, stretch as you've never stretched before." I was 5'2", and I had to be at least 5'3". Well, to be honest, only one heel touched the floor, and the doctor said 5'3.5", so I passed. Then after we were dressed, we assembled on the floor again, and this time all the married men had to step out. Then those who had dependents. Several refused to step out, but the captain knew them all and called them out, until finally there were about 66 left on the floor. Then we raised our right hands and were sworn in as soldiers. Several of those put out were crying, and we who had been chosen felt bad for the ones who could not go, but afraid we were more exultant, for we were the ones who would go. I am not certain, but I think we all went home for the last night and our goodbyes the next day. We marched out to the fairgrounds and received our government equipment, turning in our National Guard stuff. Willie Merrick and I went in together, got our equipment, and marched back to the horse barns, where we were assigned to our stalls. 2 men to a stall. From there on, we were very busy. Cleaned the guns, bayonets, belt buckles, buttons, shoes, hats, knapsacks, haversacks, canteens, ammunition belts, uniforms, underwear, and all the things a soldier must have to live out in the open. The stall I got was right next to the end. The doors opened right near our feet, and later, about the first night of May, a sleet and snowstorm hit the fairgrounds, and we who slept near the door were covered with snow and sleet as we slept in the straw in our stalls. The next day, we were almost all sick, and our hospital was taxed to limit taking care of sick. This situation was quite serious at the time, but I think now was timely, as now the medical staff had to begin to function. Some of us may have had to furnish the experience, but they were able to note their deficiencies and correct them by the time we got to camp, able to function as a military hospital is supposed to function. By the 14th, we were ready to leave, and near evening we were boarding the train. The night before, our company was marched to the city, where we began combing the saloons and bawdy houses and picking up all the soldiers who had sneaked out from camp for a last drink. I think we were till midnight in getting the last ones, but we got them without seriously hurting anyone. But we sure had a hard time of it, and we sure treated them rough. Can you imagine a drunk having to walk to the fairgrounds? They didn't like it, but this is war, and we the guards didn't like it any better than they did, so we didn't handle them with kid gloves. Well, the next day all was exciting as we took down our camp and loaded them on the train. Our folks were all out for the last few minutes with their boys. I had caught a very bad cold following a bad night a few days before when snow and rain blew in over my blanket. But I had gone to the doctor in the morning and received what we all used to get for any pain, ache, or sickness. As we used to say, if you broke a leg, got a bellyache, or stubbed your toe, you got a CC pill. I don't know what they were made up of, but from the taste and effect, I would say they were made up of cascara ammonium chloride. Didn't do any good to get a fancy illness. That's what you got, and that was all you got. Well, we finally got on the train. As I was sick, I was posted at a door as a guard, and as we pulled out, I hollered to my mother, standing bravely by my father, "Oh yes, Mom, I took out an insurance policy, and the man will be out with it in a few days." This was a thoughtless thing to say when I was going to war, and I regretted it many times afterwards. It didn't help, and I saw my mother throw herself into Dad's arms, and that was the last I saw of them until October, when war was over. As we rode along, every town turned out, and all the whistles and bells, especially church bells, broke loose, and we sure got a noisy send-off. This continued all through the trip, and when we got to East St. Louis, it seemed as if the whole town had gone crazy. All the trains in the yard, all the factories, and all the steamboats turned loose, and the noise was terrific. But soon we were on our way again. I don't know if we had anything to eat there or where, but it was past 8 o'clock after traveling over 5 hours, so we probably were fed. It was dark when we went past Cape Giraldo, and then on to Cairo, which we went through during the night. I tried to see the bridges there, but it was too dark, and the water didn't look well in the dark. The next day was Sunday. The night before, we had to shed our overcoats after we left the Cape, and it became to us just plain hot. Well, we finally came to a halt at Martin, Tennessee, and being Sunday, all the folks were going to church on every side. Local folks in plain patched, sometimes, clothes, and all scrubbed clean as you could. They had a nice, wholesome look about them. Most came in farm wagons, and were sure a surprise to us who had not ever seen locals so clean and evidently respectable. And in such numbers, fathers, mothers, and children tagging along. No cutting up, just going to a serious affair, their church. Well, during our rest there, of course, you always have the roughnecks, and soon all the loose pigs. A lot of them wandering under houses that are all up on short posts or stilts, even the store. There was one, and he tried to hold the soldiers out and leave 1 or 2 in at a time. Well, it wasn't long till he was pushed aside and a swarm trooped in. From what I heard, seeing he would not or could not wait on all that trade, so they cleaned him out. How much he got from them is a question. Another place, the man tried to be nice and finally said, "Boys, take what you want and pay what you think it's worth." Well, he sure made out better than the other one, for I saw money in dollars, quarters, and small stuff on the counter. I would roughly say he must have had over 100 in front of him, and he several times shoved some under the counter in a box he had. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't get all that he should have, but it's a cinch he would have to restock on chewing tobacco, smoking tobacco, all the candies, cake, crackers, and cookies, and many other things they could eat. I think the officers thought the situation was getting out of hand, for assembly was called, and we loaded again for the rest of the trip. We now were on the way to Nashville, Tennessee, which we reached at nearly the right time. I think just before we came to Big Pipe Stove Cliff, and since we stopped there for 20 or 30 minutes, the fellas swarmed out and were all over that cliff, cutting their names and outfits into the soft stone. I went past this cliff again in 1918, World War I, but I was not there long enough to see if any of our fellows still had their names there. All I could see was that the entire cliff was cut all over. This pipestone is a pinkish light brown. You can cut it with your knife, and in past ages the Indians and the ones before them got pieces of the rock and cut pipes out of it. I didn't get any as I couldn't buck up against such a mob, so my name is not there and I have no piece of that rock. But about pipestone, I did get a piece, now small, at Wolf Cave in Kentucky. It was not near such a nice stone, but it was tan in color, and some of the boys cut pipes from it, but we hadn't reached that part yet. From here, we left for the east towards the camp we would occupy for the balance of the war. Naturally, we thought we would be in battle before a month was over. We did not realize the months of training we would require before we were welded into a fighting force no one could be ashamed of, and that could advance the cause of the United States at that time in Cuba, or Puerto Rico, or any place we would have been placed. Well, we had an uneventful trip the rest of the way. We were uncomfortable, but no one thought of complaining. Towards daybreak, we were near our destination. So full were we with the beautiful scenery in the mountains bordering the beautiful Tennessee River. We also passed battlefields where nature now covered the scars of war at Stone River. We saw an old man who wanted to know where the fighting was and who you Yanks are after now. Well, we finally got there when we were least expecting it. We rode up to a little town called Little Georgia. A mile north we piled out, and everywhere we looked were wild strawberries. We were assembled, roll called, then told we could take it easy and rest a while. Naturally, we started after the berries, but first some so-called officer thought that a big patch of strawberries must belong to someone, and stopped us from going after them. Someone else with more sense declared them wild berries, and we fell too. I do believe I ate at least 2 quarts of berries myself, and all did as well, but I'll tell you the honest truth. Except for a few places, the patch still looked full of nice ripe berries. Also, I didn't get sick or anything from eating so many berries. We now marched to the railroad station, along the south side of which was a road, looked like a path, which we took going south to the Kelly house. We saw near here a mound about 4 feet high, and covering at least 100 or 200 square feet. We were told that was where quite a number of the horses killed in the battle were buried. At the Kelly house, we moved east on Lafayette Road and marched about 3/4 of a mile east until we reached a well with her at the side of the road, and then across a field with a small creek running east to west. This field had been a wheat field during the war, but now it was more pasture than anything, not extra weedy or many brambles. This was to be our drill field for 3 months. When we got across the field, we found ourselves in a beautiful white oak timber, with a fairly good number of pine trees. Some were very tall and large, and were of a long-leaf species. We avoided the corner or place where the timber and a road running south from the Lafayette Road meets. This was the angle or salient during the great battle on this ground held by General Baird's division. His men had a small parapet along their front built by the men while awaiting the attack. General Hood threw the cream of his troops against this corner because if he could force it back, the Federal forces would have had their left flank turned, cutting Baird and Thomas from a possible line of retreat. While this was going on, Hood had been given back, and the Confederates poured through this break across the Kelly Field and up Snodgrass Hill north of the road where the Federals held, even though a night attack was made on Baird's right, straight back to the Lafayette Road. Several regiments were in this fight, including the right attack, but I only remember one, the 4th Ohio Artillery. Their pieces changed hands 5 times during the battle, and each time were retaken and turned on the Confederates, who were trying to break through the Federal Army. A special marker on that spot tells how the Federal turned the guns on the seemingly victorious troops and poured double canister point blank into the surging forces. Well, it is history now how General Thomas got the name of Rock of Chickamauga because his troops on Snodgrass Hill held the Confederates. But I was over that battlefield, and I think if General Baird and his division had not held fast, the entire line would have been crushed. So many were killed and wounded among the Southern troops that the North had only minor battles until Atlanta was reached. But that's another story, and I'm trying to tell mine. We marched to the edge of the timber and it looked fairly level here, so here we stopped. Company having the honor of First Company, the Company C, planted their roots, and within an hour we were digging sinks for garbage, latrines, putting in floors for the officers' tents, and then putting our tents up and getting as many rocks out of the way as we could. The 3rd Wisconsin that took the ground east of us had a very stony place and built rock piles nicely squared off about 4 or 5 feet high. Well, we were named the 1st Regiment, 1st Brigade, 1st Division, 1st Arriving Corps. Just because we got on a camping ground all organized, first of all the regiments. With us was Brigade the Rough Riders, but through the influence of the Colonel, Theodore Roosevelt, they soon left us and moved to Tampa Bay. They were reinforced by Grigsby's Rough Riders, the 1st Illinois Volunteer Cavalry, and some other troops equipped at that time. But that's another story. As for us, we were introduced to the campfire way of cooking, and while the stout ones dug the sinks, others put up the tents, then assigned with others, put up the latrine, which was a deep hole, I would guess 12 feet deep, 5 feet long, and about 6 or 8 feet wide, properly protected by 2x4s and boards carpentered to fit the requirements. I don't remember much about our first meal, but I think it was mostly tomatoes, canned beans, hardtacks, and a very poor imitation of coffee. The next morning was no better. I'm not sure, but I think that's when we got our first taste of sow belly. This is a 4 or 5 inch thick piece cut from the bellies of the hogs. Above that on either side is the bacon. I believe it was usually rendered for lard, but has some deteriorated muscular resemblance that has enough firmness to be handled. But I don't ever remember any that had a real streak of lean. Fried down and allowed to drip a while, it was much like cracklins, only more fat. Since we had hardtack, the men often followed the Civil War way of frying the hardtack in the fat, making them more palatable. But we found out that flat, tasteless, and stove-hard as they were, if you got one down, it was very substantial and sustaining. After that, I rarely went anywhere without 1 or 2 in my pocket. Made no difference having them in your hip pocket. You couldn't break them anyway. I had a big Bowie knife that I used as a hatchet, and I could chip off quite a bit. Well, this was well for a short time. Soon we got coffee, but the sow belly was at times full of skippers and maggots, and since we were hungry, very hungry, we would merely flip out maggots with your fork and ate the rest. The cooks tried to help out by putting the meat in the water and bringing it to a boil. Skippers came right out, and we skimmed them off the top of the water. Also, many of the maggots, but they being slower, more of them were left in the meat, so-called. This went on until Wells got news of it. That's right, he was Brigadier General. I well remember that day he came storming in, one cook shack after another, looked and checked on all the other supplies. Then he went to Reg headquarters and laid out the officers there, saying they were thieves and even murderers, as many had died from the poor food. He then ordered all the stuff we had, returned to the thieves and robbers what had sold that stuff, and that the next day we must have potatoes, onions, beans, beef. He named other things, and all the rest of the day the wagons were moving. The next day we actually had scrambled eggs, real bacon, bread, and real coffee. Still no sugar or salt or pepper, and a lot of other things that should be there. Well, after that, there was no more trouble with the food. At this point, I will say we then had a wonderful coffee you can't buy for almost any price. Now, I do not know if it was ever even on the market anymore. It was what was called old government coffee, and came from Java. I would not be surprised if I would be informed that in those days, the government bought the entire outfit. Another one, called Old Government Mocha, was very strong, did not taste as strong as the Java, but could be guaranteed to keep you awake when you had night duty. I have since tried to locate some of these coffees, but so far have not had any definite results, through Maldner's on 6th Street, though they might have it at $1.50 per pound, so may try this someday, for that sure was coffee. During the first or second week, the non-commissioned officers were appointed, and Andrew Brooks was corporal in charge of my tent, and Sergeant Byers was appointed first sergeant to the company, and he was sure a real man and did a fine job as our first sergeant. I could keep on for hundreds of pages just on this topic, our stay at Camp Thomas, but I must record much more, and will only gloss over the camp and devote myself to those side issues that concerned me and had to do with my life and what I did. Following the appointment of the non-com, the usual drilling and hard work were the order of the day. Then one day we got an order to fix up for a big parade and inspection. Every soldier shined. Every shoe had to be well greased and brushed, uniforms brushed, all the tiers mended, and all the rest of the stuff that goes with spit and polish. And my rifle was just as nice and shiny. The wood part of stock and barrel nicely rubbed by hand whenever I could get some Vaseline to rub it with. Then we found out Governor Tanner was going to inspect us, and then we would pass in review. Well, everything went off just lovely. So the captain inspected us, then Colonel Kaler, and when he came to my gun, said it was the nicest kept gun he had seen in the regiment. Fact. The latter caused a lot of trouble before we were on board the transport that would take us to Puerto Rico, but that is still to come. To make a long story short, we drew up, and the governor, who had skipped the inspection, gave the order pass in review, take full distance, guide right, march, and then the rain came down there. When it rains, it means it, and it sure comes down. We had an order and started to march, the rain reaching our very marrow, but the governor on his horse had a nice yellow, not regulation, raincoat, and we went past him, guns at right shoulder, and as much as possible, keeping an alignment just 5 feet or so from the governor. I slipped and went down. Oh, I was up immediately, but you could have lit a cigarette on my face but for the rain. We were completely, thoroughly, and entirely wet, muddied up to our knees. Next, we were drawn into a hollow square and the governor began to talk, supposed to address us. After about an hour, might have been less, but seemed longer, the big officers in the group got him to go away and leave a subordinate to finish his speech. And as soon as the governor was out of sight, the order came. Captains, take charge of your companies. Dismiss. So we started back to camp. The men were wet. The nice clean uniforms were wet and muddied. Our guns were in bad state, requiring prompt attention, and our tempers and dispositions can only be guessed at. A short time afterwards, the sun came out, and our clotheslines soon had our duds hanging there, and we were going around in dry underwear or air in the altogether. This didn't make any difference, as there were no women within miles. Because the governor was there on that day, we were supposed to get a special treat. I suppose we did. But what I saw was steak, potatoes, baked beans, slaw, and a rice and raisin pudding and bread. By this time, we had received sacks of onions, cabbage, and such things, and thought we had it pretty good. A short time afterwards, we had a visit from Governor Stone of Pennsylvania and had to pass in review before him. The day before had rained, so the creek in the center of the field was flowing quite hard. Well, when we came to the creek to pass in review, we kind of hesitated about crossing, as it was a raging flood in small size, but the big men in front plunged right in. I could see the water reach their shoulders, so I kind of hesitated, then figured there was plenty there to pull me out if I went under. About halfway, I was swept off my feet, and if it hadn't been for some of the big guys, I might not have made it. Soon we were going up the slope of the field where the going was better, then passed in review in as nice a line as you could see anywhere. But do you know, we were then just a half mile from our camp, right straight to the left. But it is an unpardonable sin, and simply cannot be permitted that a military force can go through another force, moving or stationary. And as far as we could see, regiment after regiment was going to pass. So all we could do was march to the end of the line and then pass. Well, believe it or not, it was actually 8 miles before we could pass. And when we finally came to our camp, all we could do was sit down and rest. Then we had supper while we were resting, and I, as remember the situation, the last of the cavalry and artillery passed while we were eating. At another review, we had more experience and sense, and as we passed first, then we finished the review and turned about. I marched in the other direction that did not cut across the line, so we had grandstand seats, so to speak, and watching the whole parade until the end. Sometimes it did not take so long, as some of the divisions never did reach full strength. During all this time, we were having a bad outbreak of typhoid. I have a thought that it might have been due to the fact that the water we used for drinking and cooking came from Cloud Springs. This was the center of the federal hospital that was established during the battle, and without a doubt, many in that hospital were typhoid patients, for many were dying at that time. Anyway, we got it bad before the place where they got their water was Crawfish Springs, a river that gushes from the side of the mountain and could not be contaminated. I would estimate the size of this stream as being about 50 feet wide and 20 feet high, gushing out here in a solid stream into a lake, clear as could be. We could see things down there, 40 or 50 feet down, and fish swimming around. These were mostly perch and some bass, but I saw nothing else. This was the lake that before the battle, Sherman's cavalry rode into because it looked so shallow. A plaque there records the event, but it doesn't record any casualties. But with such awful deep water so close to the edge and such a sharp bank, It must have taken considerable work to get those who drove in. Could be a big story on one man riding in and being pulled out, because if many rode in, the situation would have been too big to avoid casualties. The creek that runs from this is called Chickamauga Creek, and gives the name to the battle fought there. The camp we occupied was called Camp Thomas, after the general that saved the day, and permitted the North to withdraw with considerable losses, but still able to fight, while the South, now beginning to bleed white, could not afford any losses. Now we were beginning to be a first-class fighting outfit. But first must tell this little side story, as it occurred about this time. My arm had become infected from the vaccination place, due to the practice of lining up the men, and as each reached the doctor, an assistant would yank off the scab, then dose it with water from a basin used by all the rest, at least 200, and though there was carbolic acid in the pan, infection was almost a sure thing for the lack of simple sanitation. After the acid, you got a new wad of cotton bandaged on good and firm, then were sent on your way. Finally, I got sick, and when the bandage on my arm was taken off, it stank like decayed meat, and the doctor looked at it and said, "Gangrene has developed. We may have to take the arm off. Be back here this afternoon and we'll take care of it." That was enough for me, and I bolted out of there like a scared rabbit. Being sick as I was, the guard that was sent after me easily caught up, and I explained why I was trying to get away and please don't take me back as they want to take my arm off. The man had a heart and let me get away, and I crept into my tent like a wounded animal, too sick to realize anything. That afternoon we were called out on battle maneuvers. I was not excused by sickness and had to go out with the company. Our company was out as pickets and located enemy that put us under a heavy fire, so we fell back to our skirmishers, who then went ahead and we stayed back. A bad practice we had in these battles to put gravel in front of our position, and in that way keeping the enemy at a respectable distance. We were called up to support the skirmishers now, and when the firing got heavy, I thought I had received a wound in my arm at the place where that awful sore was, so I turned over on my back. One of my buddies asked me if I'd been hurt, and I told him yes. Someone had shot me in the arm. Well, I pulled out my first aid packet and got my pocket knife, was very sharp, slit my sleeve, and started to cut all that green infected flesh. The blood flowed very briskly, but I soon had all the bad part out and only fresh red bleeding flesh left. I then opened the salicylic acid pack to stop bleeding and poured it all in the wound, then packed it down in a tight pack. The bleeding had stopped, so I went on and bandaged it. And I almost think, in spite of pain, suffering, and being just plain sick, I was beginning to enjoy being a hero. Poor little sick kid. I sure was giving my guardian angel a heck of a job. Well, I don't remember much after that. I got to camp. I don't know if I had anything to eat or drink, but I know I went to sleep on my blanket on the ground. I don't know if I took off my uniform. I know that I answered roll call also in the morning, but I must have been dressed, but I don't remember it. Did I have breakfast? I honestly don't know. Only some days afterwards, my tent mates said I didn't stink now, and I began to be more awake. Noticed my arm was shrinking, and when I changed the bandage, it was looser and had to be tied tighter. To shorten this, in about a week or 10 days, I was noticeably better, and my arm practically normal again. Good color and firmness, so like a smart aleck, I marched to the hospital, rolled up my sleeve before the doctor, and said, "See, that's the arm you wanted to cut off." The doctor was quite nice about it and asked how it had happened. I explained it in short, bitter words, for I was terribly hurt, but the doctor continued to be nice and reasonable, then said, "That is really just fine. We will now wash it and put a new bandage on it." I reared up and said, "Oh no, you don't. That's how it happened," and away I went, and no one to stop me this time. During another maneuver before this time or after, I don't know, we were out as an outpost in skirmish order when we heard the enemy blow officers' call. About 8 or 10 of us thought we'd investigate and got quite close to their line. Their guards were easily eluded, and we got up near the horses, for the officers' mounts, and someone conceived the idea we should run off with the horses. Well, it didn't take much time, and we had all the bridles tied to a horse in front, about 3 horses to each man, others to cover our retreat. Well, everything went off just perfect, and away we rode off with all the horses that were the officers' mounts, leaving them all to continue the action on foot. It would be difficult for anyone to realize what consternation that caused. Ask an army man, and he may have a job keeping from laughing. Well, there was an awful hullabaloo, and they called in the cavalry, and the ones who lost their horses were declared to have lost the action unless they wanted to continue on foot. Well, they didn't want to do that, so they just quit to the laughter of all who heard about it, and we were not caring who we told it to. So it became a story that was even used as a reason behind the order later used, but now not necessary. But we did expect to be punished for it. But I think some of the higher-ups got such a laugh out of it the matter was dropped, and we were quietly told by our own superior officers not to talk about it anymore, and not to let some of the newspaper guys know about it. Well, we kept it mum, but we were afraid that any day these offended officers would catch up with us. And then what? One thing that protected us was the fact we moved around quite a bit, and being busy, they had no time to hatch any revenge plot. About this time, I went or was sent about 3 miles east on a picket line. My post was a nice one. This was after the action I'm writing about later, from a monument to the 12th Michigan Cavalry that fought a night action there and were all wiped out. Down where the battle was fought is a dismal, swampy ground through which runs a brook that makes considerable noisy commotion as it jumps around among the stones and over a waterfall hollow underneath. My beat was higher up on a good road fenced and between this battlefield and the guard post. About midnight, I heard a scream down in the hollow. "They're after me! Help me! They're after me!" Soon came a soldier running, no gun, no hat, and very scared. I tried to stop him, and I could not do anything till I stuck him in the thigh. The bayonet went in about 3 or 4 inches, and that stopped him. He was unaware of the bayonet wound, but I had stopped him. I asked him what was wrong, as I recognized him as the guard that had to cover that bad place. All I could make out was the goblins were after him, and the ghosts of the soldiers killed at that place were groaning and howling, and the horses were screaming and thrashing around in the swamp. And he knew they were after him because ghost lights follow him as he walked his beat. I now did something I had no right to do, but I knew Sergeant Byers was in charge of the picket out here, so I called for Sergeant of the Guard number 2. I was then. And he had heard some of the commotion this fellow made. So he came at once with 2 men. He left them back and asked me what it was about between us. We saw he had deserted his post, and in those days they were very strict. We talked around there, and finally, after my suggestion, Sergeant Byers changed the guard sheet to show me down in the hollow, and this bird up above in my nice post. Fact is, I was curious as all get out. I don't know how they accounted for the gun, as I didn't see it when I went down there. Now I was going to see ghosts, goblins, etc., etc., at work, and if you don't think I was curious, you don't know your dad even then. Well, just simple analysis resolved the booming, roaring, moaning sound to the brook and its waterfall. The screams were there, all right, but were evidently night birds. The owls, frogs, tree toads, all contributed their share. Next, the goblins and their lights were quickly explained when a jack-o'-lantern popped up right out of the marshy ground. Others could be seen popping out all around there. Well, when this was over, the ghosts had been laid. I think that's the right word. I think the next day was Sunday, and as my beat or post led up the hill to a crossroad, I was now instructed to stop and search every vehicle for contraband liquor that was somehow getting into the camp. Along about daylight, I stopped a light wagon that had 3 men in it and 3 boxes. Looked like boxes of canned corn. ECT Cetera used to be shipped in. They were filled with sawdust, so when I came to them, I shoved my hand down in and felt small, flat bottles that pulled out. And sure enough, they were small, half-pint bottles containing what we called squirrel whiskey, a stuff so potent and rotten that it was said that the one who took a good drink of it would climb a tree and bark like a squirrel. Well, these were disposed of in less than an hour, their stuff in custody, and they in the guardhouse. Subsequently, they were tried and convicted, but a dumb guard was placed over them. And though the guard tent was right next to an officer's tent, they cut the back of the tent and were gone. When a sharp non-com checked the tent and found them gone, a slash in the back of the tent showed how come. You know, somehow I felt sore about it. These fellows were so evidently quickly that I felt that the best they should have had was a stretch in the pen. Now going back to covering my post, later in the day, just after noon when I came on again, I stopped a buggy containing a man and a young lady that proved to be his daughter. Their story were true. The man explained he wanted to take a picture of the monument of the 12th Michigan Cavalry right there on the rise of ground we were standing on at the time. Well, I had no objection. He explained he was in the 12th Michigan Cavalry that was attacked that night near that hollow where the goblins consorted, and that a great part of their outfit was killed or wounded there. So when he proceeded in his preparations to take the picture, I asked if he would mind if I stood on a corner of the base. After the war, I got in touch with the family, and that is the picture I have, the only one, showing me in my old outfit, but a very clean guy. Naturally, I value that picture very highly, and when it began fading about 10 years ago, Joe made a copy of it that is very good. But features and such that need sharpness are faded. But you can recognize your dad anyhow. It's hard to carry sequence exactly in this article, but I think it would not be.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.